Hello, welcome back to Child Maltreatment Module 3 on mandated reporting. To take this class is to take a course in mandated reporting. So let's discuss what it means to be a mandated reporter. So after this class, you will be a mandated reporter who is tasked as a professional required by law to report suspected cases of child maltreatment to the proper authorities. So what that means is this is training that you would receive if you are a teacher, clergy, athletic coach, anybody working with kids is a mandated reporter. So mandated reporter laws were adopted in the 1960s. This is around the time of the article, The Battered Child Syndrome. This article, published in 1962, began a movement. So this led to a national conference on child abuse sponsored by the federal government. And physicians at this conference recommended laws mandating physicians to report child abuse. So this in turn led to other disciplines also leading to their own mandated reporting laws. So the battered child syndrome was the article really heralded by the American Medical Association, and it soon adopted mandatory reporting laws. So the AMA really became a pioneer in a professional agency kind of leading out in the front. So this was followed by the American Humane Association and the Children's Bureau of the U.S. Department of Health. They adopted mandated reporting laws as well. All states had mandatory reporting laws by 1967. Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act of 1974 further pushed the issue forward. States then were required to list mandated reporters, and to provide them immunity. So what this means is if you are a teacher and you suspect abuse and you report abuse to the Department of Human Services, Child Protective Services, then you cannot be prosecuted, or sued for reporting. You acted in good faith. Now, states decide who mandated reporters are. All physicians are mandated reporters. Initially, only physicians were mandated reporters. But teachers, daycare providers, religious personnel, counselors, social service personnel, and police all are added to the list as mandated reporters. In some states, anyone with knowledge of abuse must report. Mississippi, we are in that list. This would also include Kentucky, Mississippi, North Carolina. Now we also have a classification of privileged communication. So a confessional setting. So for instance, if a Catholic priest hears someone, a parishioner, report abuse, they are granted immunity from this. New Hampshire, West Virginia, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Rhode Island, and Texas. Permissive reporters are non-mandated reporters who are encouraged to report abuse if maltreatment is suspected. And I really consider all of us to be permissive reporters. Each of us should take that responsibility seriously. If you suspect abuse, you should report. Informed consent. This is the ethical requirement that participants voluntarily agree to limitations of confidentiality. So counselors, such as myself, who are either licensed clinical social workers or licensed professional counselors, licensed marriage and family therapists, may be working with a client. Usually on the first day of counseling, in the first session, the therapist will inform the client or patient of confidentiality and limitations of confidentiality. So for instance, a therapist may tell their client or patient that anything you tell me is confidential, unless you happen to tell me something that would indicate harm to self or others, in which case I must act. And so putting this out there at the beginning lets the client or patient know that there are limitations. Reasonable cause is reporting abuse in the sense that it should occur if reasonable suspicion exists. Experienced colleagues are those whose opinion you trust, and they should be consulted. So we report with reasonable cause. It doesn't mean that you report with reasonable doubt. Reasonable doubt is the standard by which it requires for someone to be convicted of a crime. You are not on a jury if you suspect a child being abused. You are operating in a different capacity. For counselors, consultation is critical. So at what point do we have a concern for a child being abused, and at what point do we realize that perhaps we just need to get some consultation and find out what experienced colleagues think about a situation? So how would we go about reporting? There's a National Child Abuse Hotline, 1-800-4-A-CHILD. You would be mindful to note the date, the time, the location. If you've seen suspicious marks or comments from the child, you'd have to note the alleged perpetrator. Now, anonymous reporting is acceptable because, as we've mentioned, you're acting in good faith. Even though this is confidential, some people still feel more comfortable not providing their name. Perhaps they're fearful of being called as a witness in a court trial down the road. So anonymous reporting is acceptable, but it's not recommended because a social worker would likely want to come back and ask you more questions. Perhaps the police would need more information. Failure to report could include misdemeanor charges, and for physicians, it could mean malpractice. Also for counselors, if counselors have already shared that informed consent and the limitations to confidentiality, and yet they find that one of their clients or patients is harming a child or is aware of abuse, if they do not report abuse, they could be cited as malpractice. To protect children, mandated reporters must report. Effective and accurate reporting techniques requires training, and that's the largest part of this class. The reason why you're taking this class is to protect children. We're hoping down the road that you may go into a field that puts you in a position where you have access to these kind of cases. So for instance, if you choose education or social work or counseling or nursing, any of these fields, then it could very well be the case that you happen upon children who are being mistreated, and you will need to know what to do next. Nationally, there are about 3 million referrals concerning 5 million children, and they're made to child protection agencies in every state, through all states combined. So approximately 2/3 are accepted for assessment. So we would say of these 5.5 million children, these 3 million referrals, about 2/3 are considered credible enough for investigation. Many physically abused children are known to a number of adults. Physical abuse is one of the easiest to recognize in some cases because there are, now, not all physical abuse is easy to recognize. Let me clarify that in cases of child sexual abuse, there are not and may not be physical markings that are observable to the public. But in a stereotypical or in a commonly, teacher sees a child with burn marks that are suspicious or bruising. These oftentimes get referred more commonly than sexual abuse. Mandated reporters fail to report 60% of the cases where abuse is suspected, and this is coming from research reported by McCoy and Keene. Mandated reporting laws have reduced child abuse deaths by 50%. And 66% of all substantiated child abuse cases come from mandated reporters. Child abuse rarely stops without intervention, according to the ABLE study. And this should be a reminder that we must be vigilant to report cases when we suspect abuse. So what can I do to help? Mandated reporter training such as this class. Understand how kids disclose abuse. Recognize behavioral and physical signs of abuse. Help parents on the edge. Be involved in mentoring parents that might be at risk. So in cases where parents may be young, uneducated, living in poverty, struggling, stressed, could be that simply stepping in as a mentor in some of these situations may help prevent abuse. Preach and teach that abuse is preventable. Spread the word to coworkers. Child abuse is a global problem, and specifically in the United States, one thing that we need to communicate is the child abuse accommodation syndrome, because the dynamics of disclosure are not always monolithic. They're not the same. And one thing that we find in the child abuse accommodation syndrome is that sometimes children are very reticent to disclose abuse. So the child abuse accommodation syndrome it's not a syndrome in the sense of being a medical diagnosable condition. It really speaks to dynamics that are commonly seen when kids are abused. So in talking about the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, the first thing that we see is secrecy. Abuse of a sexual nature has to happen in secrecy, or else it's not maintained, and it can be prevented. And so in terms of maintaining secrecy, abusers will prey on a child's helplessness, and that may vary in terms of dynamics, how old the child is. Usually requires entrapment. So predators will groom children and will even groom the environment, developing relationships with the parents. And over time, children may become what seems to be accommodating. They may come to have a relationship, or they may fear what will happen if the abuse is made public. And so oftentimes this leads to delayed, conflicting, and unconvincing disclosures, and even retraction. In many cases, they find that what have been feared, what has been threatened, has taken place. So secrecy happens only when child and perpetrators are alone. Sexual abuse happens in secrecy. Secrecy in and of itself is a source of fear, and secrecy is also a promise of safety. So children will oftentimes be very vulnerable. So you see, the younger the child and the more immature, this produces a sense of helplessness. Children are taught to obey, and also threats of harm or even the loss of love may make the child feel helpless. Since the child is weaker than the perpetrator, he or she learns to accept the situation and survive. So there may be dissociating that takes place. There's other coping mechanisms. The child cannot create a psychic economy. Feelings of rage may cause suicide, self-mutilation, and promiscuity. So McCoy and Keene discussed this in reviewing the child abuse accommodation syndrome, that we do see children who are severely abused kind of block portions of this from their memory. They can develop other coping mechanisms, and if they fail to really find something that works, it may lead to some kind of self-harm. We see children disclose in a way that is sometimes unconvincing. Very few children voluntarily disclose abuse. So in many cases, children only disclose abuse when it's discovered by the outside. Many disclosures are made by rebellious and adolescents or teenagers, and this may be a striving for individuality and freedom. We often find a retraction. So according to Summit, in the aftermath of disclosure, the child discovers that the bedrock fears and threats underlying the secrecy are true. So maybe the abuser says, well, if you disclose this, then me and your mother will break up, and your mother and you and your brothers and sisters will be poor because I provide for the family, and you'll have to go to homeless shelters. And sometimes this is exactly what happens, and kids recant to try to make things go back to the way they were, so their brothers and sisters are fed and clothed. Sorensen and Snow study found out of 116 cases of documented abuse, 75% of children initially denied. 78% made a tentative disclosure, such as I forgot. And 96% made an active disclosure. So these are kids who actively disclose, but when things happen that are terrible and bad and challenging, they get into the legal system, then a vast majority of them will recant. After active disclosure, 22% recanted. A child's fear was realized. So 22% is a significant number after active disclosure. So Summit also reports retraction, that this is problematic. This is ongoing. A tentative disclosure may be something phrased such as I forgot. Protecting a child is good for the community, and when in doubt, we should always report. Domestic violence also costs the community, truancy, school dropouts, health problems, and you find some interesting dynamics when children are exposed to domestic violence. It's one of those early childhood adverse experiences. Domestic violence may lead to suicide attempts, criminal behavior, drugs and alcohol, early adult unemployment. We as the community need to be mindful of things like domestic violence and the role that they may play in harming children. So moving forward, I want to hear what you have to say in discussion boards about how you might serve as an effective mandated reporter. Keep in mind how children and the way they disclose may impact a case. If you see some recantation and the child seems a little wishy-washy, it may be important to kind of check in. Are you more likely to just discard this allegation altogether? It may not be in the best interest of the child. So this is all something that, these are all things that will be good for us to discuss. All right, take care.